Good morning, everybody. This is Mike Borges, Executive Director of ASBO New York. I want to welcome the 500 plus members who have registered for today's webinar on the state budget. I first want to thank everyone for the work that you do in keeping our schools and BOCES running under these difficult circumstances. We greatly appreciate the efforts that you have made. And for your continuing membership in ASBO. I will now turn it over to Andrew Van Alstyne, our Director of Research, to start the presentation, along with Tom Tatum, our Deputy Director of Government Relations. Andrew?
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. We're thrilled to be virtually joining you to do our budget webinar for this year. As you can see on your screen, hopefully, that we've made a copy of the presentation available on our state budget page. We'll also mention that this is a great resource to use in general. So asbonewyork.org/state budget. Go get a copy of the presentation now if you want to follow along. How this is going to work is I'm going to talk through some of the state aid components of the budget, and then I'll turn it over to Tom, who will go through some of the policy from the budget. Throughout, you can use the Q&A feature, and we will try to answer those questions either as they come or at the end. But so use Q&A to submit questions. We are going to get started. So I told you we're doing the next budget. So in addition to our budget page, we also have our COVID-19 resource page, which tries to compile all of the relevant information and guidance that's coming out of the state, whether it's executive orders or guidance from SED or other documents. So that's a page to check. And then we've also used our time working remotely to reactivate the ASBO New York Twitter account. So for up-to-date news, follow us there as well. We're going to get started. But before we look at the budget, I want to tell you some things we're not going to be able to answer. These are questions that I know are on the forefront of your minds because we hear them regularly, and we're also trying to get answers to them. So the first, probably the single most asked question these days is, what do we do about our contracts? Should we pay contracts? If we're not using the services, are we allowed to pay the contracts? If we do pay them, will we get state aid on these services? The answer is we don't know. We know that SED knows and the executive knows, and they're working on it, but they have not provided an answer to us yet. The second question is, what do we do about school budget votes? What's going to happen and how might they change this year? Again, we don't know. We do know that as it exists now, the budget calendars are built around the date of the vote, and they are built in statute. So they work backwards. So unless things change, which they might, once there's a date set, then everything will build backwards from that. But we don't know yet. We have concerns that we've expressed, questions we've asked about votes, revotes, contingent budgets, all of those questions. And when we get answers, we'll obviously share them with you as soon as we hear. So that said, let's get started about the budget. I think the single biggest takeaway in the state budget this year is there's uncertainty in state aid, much more so than in the past. So the budget, as we'll talk about, has built-in triggers based on either revenue shortfalls or spending beyond what's budgeted. But the best case scenario for school districts is that their foundation aid for 2020-21 will be frozen. And there's good news in the budget, in the non-school aid parts of this. As Tom will be covering in the section, some of the policies that ASBO has been advocating for, including the rejection of the expense-based aids, common sense changes to time off for voting, and the extension of allowances for small employers to be part of healthcare consortia, are all policies that ended up in the active budget. So this is what we're looking at with the 0.4% increase in state aid. This is, as we can see, very much driven by the increase in transportation aid, the only significant source of growth. The rest of the aid categories all were more or less flat. There's a small decline in special education spending in the budget. But the big one that is going to be jumping out is the flat foundation aid. So this flat foundation aid, there are some concerns beyond just the lack of an increase. The first is we're talking about how the state got there, which is going to have consequences into the future potentially, and also, again, this potential for mid-year aid cuts. But one of the big takeaways is that the more a district relies on state aid, the more the freeze affects them, right? So for a district that might be getting, a fraction of a percent of its overall budget derived from state aid, yes, the freeze isn't great, but that freeze is also not going to have the consequences that it might for a district that the vast majority of their budget is built around state aid. And so how this small increase in 2021 total aid is determined is you get your last year's foundation aid, full expense-based aids. So the final budget rejected the executive's proposal to change expense-based aids. So it rejected the consolidation, it rejected the changes to certain kinds of transportation aid, it rejected the changes to building aid. And then the state reduced its share of school aid, $1.1 billion, and then backfilled that with the federal stimulus money. So that's how we arrive at that 0.4% increase overall. On your school aid runs, there's a pandemic adjustment. This line, we're going to talk about how it got there, but it's also not something you need to pay attention to because it's not really going to matter anymore. So the federal stimulus, the CARES Act, it allocated money to states and then to schools based on Title I. So New York, when it set up the pandemic adjustment, your pandemic adjustment is your share of Title I funding taken out of $1.1 billion, right? And then they added that money to districts, took away that money from districts, kept them all flat. So when thinking about potential mid-year cuts, don't focus on the pandemic adjustment because it's unlikely that the state is going to use that amount for any potential reductions. For a number of reasons. One is that because of what Title I does, that would be a very regressive cut, and that does not seem in line with what either the executive or the legislature has been doing with state aid. So what are these mid-year reductions potential? The state has established, the budget has established 3 time periods where it will sort of step back and compare both revenues and spending with what was anticipated. So the first period is April 1st to 30th. The second period is May 1st to June 30th. And then the final period is July 1st to December 31st. For each of these periods, when they end, if revenues are less than 99% of what was anticipated, or spending is more than 101% of what was budgeted, the director of budget can then put in a plan to decrease spending across the board as much as possible to bring it in line with either the budgeted spending or the revenue, the actual revenue. These reductions, again, there are a couple things. There's some things the state spends on that it legally can't cut, but the language isn't very specific, so we don't know how this will be implemented. But it does say that trying to distribute them as equally as possible, right? And once DOB comes up with a plan, the legislature then has 10 days to adopt an alternative plan through concurrent resolution. If they develop that, that goes into effect. If they don't, the DOB plan goes into effect. So this April 1st to 30th period that we're in right now is our first big window into what this might look like. All right. So what is a district's worst case scenario? We do and we don't have some insight into that. The insight we do have is that the Stimulus Act as it exists put a floor on how much a state could cut its school aid. So there's a maintenance of effort requirement required to be able to keep the stimulus money. And from what we've heard from the legislature, there's the space for approximately $500 million in additional cuts the state can make before it triggers that MOE, passes the MOE threshold. If it were to pass that threshold, it would either have to get a successful waiver from the Department of Education, in which case there is no floor in any cuts, or it would give back the stimulus money, which we know the state's not going to give back $1.1 billion. So as a working hypothesis, we can say that there's space for $500 million in additional cuts. The challenge here is that we don't know the form, how those might be distributed between districts. Because of that, there are too many unknowns to be able to actually answer at a district level what is the worst case scenario. But if we think about $500 million and then we look at overall budgeted state spending, that's less than 2%, right? It's not, we saw with the GEA adjustments that the reductions weren't distributed equally, but it would be unusual for a district, especially a district that relies on state aid, to get a significantly larger cut than that. So that's the scale of kinds of cuts that are possible with this $500 million amount. But again, we don't know, and there's always that potential for a waiver. So the takeaway from this is that, particularly with the delayed budget votes, we are encouraging members, just like NISCUS has proposed or suggested, wait until after this April 30th window, see what the state does with its revenue and budget spending analysis before finalizing your budget. Right. And then, as I said, there are consequences going forward. The federal stimulus is a one-time act, so an infusion of just over $1 billion from federal money. That means when the state comes to make the 21-22 school aid and budget, it will have to increase its share of spending $1.1 billion just to keep aid flat. Right? And to put it in perspective, since 2017-18, that's larger than each year's overall school aid increase. So either there will be a source of federal stimulus, or there will be a challenge for state aid or a need for the state to significantly increase its spending. So Tom, have you looked through these questions yet? Do we have any aid-specific ones?
There are a bunch of questions. We've got 15 questions.
I don't see any. Let's see.
Maybe the question regarding the how should we estimate 2020, 2021 transportation aid?
Unfortunately, the answer there is we'll have to go get asked for information on that. We don't have a good answer for that one at this point. So someone looking for a link, if you're looking for a copy of the slides, again, it's asbonewyork.org/state budget. We've posted the slideshow there. In terms of the adjustment period, yes, someone asked April 30th. They have a period of time after that to negotiate for the DOB to put out its plan and the legislature to react to it. Within that, it's not going to be, I imagine, secret. So if they're going to be talking about reductions, DOB will be working with the legislature in developing its plan, even though it has the sole authority to develop a plan. So I would expect shortly after April 30th that we would know something about a general sense of what to expect. And then there's the I think 5-day window for the state or for the DOB, and then 10 days the legislature respond once it's released.
Just a quick reminder to attendees, if you could put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom rather than the chat box, it'll help us keep track of questions so we can make sure we answer them all.
So I'm going to just run through all of the budget questions right now to just sort of restate what we'd said earlier, which is we don't know when the school vote will occur. We do know NISCUS had proposed, and we had also agreed with a suggestion that as a one-time thing, if school districts are proposed budgets that are compliant with the tax cap, school board should be able to adopt them rather than all of the risk and challenge of doing a vote under these circumstances, it's very clear that that's not going to go anywhere. So there will be, I think the expectation is there will be a community vote on school budgets. We don't know when that date will be set. We know it won't be any sooner than June 1st. And then once that's set, the executive has the option under, the governor has, with his executive powers, is the option to alter the calendar as needed, but absent any changes, the existing requirements will just be back dated from whenever the vote is established, right? So you'll, if it's set for date X, then you'll subtract days to figure out when you have to send notifications, newsletters, etc. But until then, we don't know. Okay. I think what I'm going to do now is I will toss it to Tom to go through the policy dimensions, and then we'll skim. I'll go through these and we'll try to answer some at the end as well.
Good morning, everybody. Can you just click there? So we have taken this opportunity to highlight the policy proposals that are in the state budget. We've kind of color coordinated them. So if the header is green, it's a positive development for school districts and SBOs. If it's black, it's sort of neutral. And if it's a red header, then it is actually a negative development from the budget. So the first one is the small group employer provisions for health consortia. This has been something that's been on our legislative agenda for several years now. While we do not have a permanent solution, the enacted budget does include the extension of provisions allowing employers between 51 and 100 employees to remain members of their healthcare consortia. So these provisions were extended an additional year and now expire December of 2022. We will be continuing to advocate for a more permanent solution, but in the meantime, this is adds a little breathing room to that problem. Prior year adjustments. So this is a mixed result in the enacted budget. The enacted budget did reject the original proposal to shorten the window for school districts by which they had to submit their prior year adjustment requests. And it also rejected, as previously mentioned, the aid consolidation proposals. So because of that, the prior year adjustments can still be requested for all expense-based aids. However, the negative that goes along with this is it does not include any increased funds to pay off the prior year adjustments. I know we just spoke to a member yesterday who said that she just got a prior adjustment payment from the early 2000s paid this year. So it's still a long wait for those requests to be handled by the state. However, you will still be able to make those requests as you currently do. So that's a mixed bag there. So there was changes in the state aid for special education placement in residential schools. Up until this point, the state did cover 18.424% of those costs for school districts who had to make placements for their students in residential schools outside of New York City. This year's budget does eliminate the state share of that expense. So the school district share does increase by that 18.424%. So the school districts are now required to pay 56.848% of that of those expenses. This was included in the budget with a 1-year sunset, so it would expire April 1st, 2021. However, it's unlikely that that will actually be the case. It'll probably be extended. New York City has been paying that 56% for several years now, and it's probably the state's way of saying this is now a school district expense going forward. There was, in the enacted budget, the state adopted the executive's proposal to create a regional high school in Syracuse. followed the executive's proposal regarding the construction, collaboration with the county, the ownership and functioning properties of the Syracuse City School District, who will serve as the board for the regional high school, and provided additional language regarding the adult learning programs that will also take place in this regional learning center. But it is something that ASBO has been advocating for, the creation of these regional high schools in previous years. So it's good to see the state looking at creative ways to solve some issues such as that. And STAR, the legislature in the enacted budget did reject the executive's proposal to lower income thresholds for people to qualify for STAR credit rather than the STAR exemption, and those shifts that are occurring. So that is a positive. It also corrected an issue where property owners who were delinquent on their property taxes were able to continue to receive their STAR credit checks in the mail, despite the fact that they haven't been paying their property taxes. So that will no longer be the case. If you are a property owner who owes property taxes, you won't receive that benefit check from the state. And you know, a really big victory for our members was the paid time off for voting changes last year. As you are all aware, there was some language that allowed all employees to take up to 4 hours to go vote. This year, the legislature and the executive came to the agreement that if an employee has 4 hours, either before their shift and the opening of polls or after their shift and the closing of polls, they will no longer qualify for that paid time off to go vote. This was something that was an issue, especially considering the school's consolidated workday. We were very happy to see this included in the enacted budget. And we thank everybody who was vocal on this issue and signed the petition last year. I think it really made a difference when we were discussing this issue with the Assembly Chair and the Senate Chair of Education, who were advocates for this proposal. And that's it as part of the presentation. I think we're going to go through some questions now, and hopefully you know, either be able to give you answers or let you know that we will be looking for those answers from SED and the executive.
Yeah, so first, thank you to Tom and Mike and everyone at ASBO for helping pull this off. Rebecca Sheehan, our professional development coordinator, has done incredible work last few weeks. Joy Figueroa, communications, and et cetera. The whole staff has been working together to make a virtual ASBO pretty successful so far. And we are here to answer your questions or get answers when we can answer them directly. But I put Tom and my information on this last slide, so you can contact us. Our office phones are directed to our cell phones, so you can just call our offices and we'll be able to pick up right then. I also want to thank the ASBO Government Relations Committee, who gave us incredibly helpful feedback on this presentation yesterday. So getting this on the questions. A couple people asked, one of the big ones, and we don't know the answer fully yet, is this April 30th window. Does that affect 1920 or 2021 school aid? We don't know. So that's another thing to watch out for. Questions about how to account for the federal stimulus money. As far as I know, the money goes to the state, which is then used to just deduct and add in school aid. So I don't think school districts need to worry about accounting for it. If we hear anything else, we'll obviously let you know. Brian Tousignan asks one of our big questions that we don't know. Again, we don't know the revenue projections. So did the state build a budget based on sharp declines in revenue, in which case it wouldn't be unusual or wouldn't be shocking if the actual matched up with the projections? Or did they build a budget based on the economy quickly rebounding? And if it doesn't, then there might be deep cuts. We don't know. So that's, again, why we are anxiously watching the April 30th window, and we're encouraging districts to be very cognizant of that when thinking about planning.
There was a question on, I lost it now, on the shift in the committee's, the education placement costs. Let me just find that question.
Yeah, we have, that's the one, how much it is.
Well, no, actually, no. So there's multiple questions. The estimated cost for that is 26 million from the budget. However, we are still looking to see how that cost will be spread to districts and what districts are going to be most impacted. I know Andrew's been contacting various state agencies trying to figure out who has that data. The legislature was also looking for it. SCD was looking for it, both externally, internally.
What we want to do with that is know two big things. One, how much does this impact school districts, and also how much does it vary? So if we can, we're trying to get multi-year data, so we can look at, is this an expense that can just pop up? Is this an expense that districts sort of sustain? So we're and how significant is it? The state answer is it's about $25–26 million is their anticipated impact, but we again want to verify that.
So another note on that, can you describe what a residential school is, was the question. So in the enacted budget, it was both committees and special education placements. So non-residential, I should correct myself there. So for school districts which need to make a placement outside of their district to provide adequate special education services, as well as the final budget included the responsibility for maintenance costs of state-operated schools for the deaf and blind to school districts as well. Again, we need to determine what that fiscal impact will be in total to school districts and how that will be distributed. But that's the information we have on that subject for now.
So a couple of ones. So the expense-based aids, what we do know is they're unchanged. So they should function as they have in the past. What we don't know is how the state is going to address them during the period of school New York pause. So that's what we do and don't know. So your expense-based aids for next year, absent what the state has not determined yet about what you should do and what aid is available on contracts, while kids aren't in school. Other than that, the expense-based aids are unchanged. So the big changes that would have threatened BOCES or really cut back certain types of building aid or certain types of transportation aid, none of those are here. In terms of going back to the state budget questions, I want to stress again, we are hopeful that this doesn't affect 1928, but we don't know that for sure. So that's something that's one of those questions as we watch Deeper Window. And then in terms of how it is done, as far as I know, it is the revenue and the spending in that time period matched with the projected revenue and spending in that time period. And if the revenue is more than 99% short, or if the spending is more than 101% of the budgeted amount, then that's what will trigger the adjustments to bring them to that level. There's also a provision where they say to make a cut in April and then the economy explodes, and at the end of the next review session, revenue is much, much higher, they can restore cuts that have been previously made. So if we do have that kind of sharp peak of the economic downturn, then there is the potential for mid-year restorations as well.
Quickly, we have a question here regarding the STAR credit exemption, just trying to go into it a little more. So the executive proposed lowering the income threshold by which you would be, people who are currently receiving the STAR exemption, to be forced to move over to the STAR credit program. That was rejected. ASBO's position regarding the STAR program is that we much prefer the STAR exemption program because it requires less state overhead, less the mailing of millions of checks to New Yorkers. complicates the system. And the more we can do to limit the amount of changes made to that system and keep the most people on the exemption program so that the state is just giving those money directly to school districts, so taxpayers are shielded from some of those tax increases, the better in our view. So that was a minor victory in the budget by preventing more people from being shifted over to the STAR credit program.
So I want to just do a highlight. Jamie asked about the idea of linking mid-year cuts and the pandemic adjustment. And the reason, and I do want to stress that the pandemic adjustment, from your perspective, shouldn't be something that you need to, I think, focus on, other than being able to explain to people who ask about why is there a pandemic adjustment, their stimulus money. Because this is how the state had to divide it in its allocation, but it's not giving you the money and then it's just cutting aid by an amount equal to the federal stimulus money, and this is how it allocated it. So when the budget language was first coming out, because bills were not being, were coming out one at a time, when we first read about the pandemic adjustment and the mid-year reductions, it sounded like there might have been a link, but I don't believe, we're pretty sure that there is no link between the pandemic adjustments and any mid-year cuts. So to answer Jamie's questions, yes, don't worry about using that as the gauge for what might be cut. So for districts that they get a lot of Title I money, that would be good news, because they could, if you looked at what that share is, it could be a huge cut. For districts that don't receive Title I money at all or very little, your cut might be larger than the pandemic adjustment, depending on what ends up happening. But again, our working theory is that absent any other changes, that the floor of cuts, or the ceiling for cuts, how we're looking at it, is $500 million additional to, because they've already cut $1.1 billion, but that cut was made up with stimulus money. I also want to add here, as we go through the Q&A, and I'm glad everyone's sticking around and being patient with us while we work through this, that if you do come up with questions, concerns, insights, thoughts, any of those after this, again, email Tom or I, and we'd be happy to do what we can to respond or help out.
Yeah. Again, I think I need to clarify something I said earlier today, regarding the committees and special education placements. That is for the residential placements that increase was for. So it's the CSE residential placements, and then the residential state operated costs for the schools of deaf and blind. That is where that increase is for. I appreciate that question.
And we don't know what can be done if the board's already adopted a budget, but that's a question that we are asking. Property tax report card, a couple questions on that. Again, we're working on it, but I think the assumption is that the date is not going to be fixed, but we will let you know. Someone asked about flexibility and use of reserves. This is something that happened during the GEA, and it's certainly something that we have talked about, and we've talked about with SCD, but there is no actual answer on that yet, so we don't know. But it's definitely been in conversation. Yes, anticipated increases in the future in ERS and TRS rates with the current climate. I mean, given how ERS and TRS rates are determined, I believe a 5-year average, a large part of it's the 5-year average of the investment returns. I mean, given what's happened in the market, unless things change, that could lead to an increase in ERS and TRS rates. Again, we won't know until we know. Someone asked a chart. We will absolutely. So we put a hypothetical calendar in Newswire last week that was just, this is the earliest possible dates if they don't change it. But we don't want to put out any concrete calendar dates based on, you know, all these different scenarios. What I will say, because it's something we are asked regularly, is once a date is selected and we know whether or not they are altering, you know, the corresponding timeline, we will absolutely be releasing a full calendar with what you need to do and what timelines they're expected. In terms of collapsing the timeline, in our conversations with SED, there are some parts of the timeline that they don't think can be meaningfully collapsed because they need time to respond to them. But that's, again, their position. You know, it would be either a legal or executive order that would change the calendar.
Another question regarding the total cost to school districts on those state-operated schools for the deaf and the blind, because the state has eliminated their share of the cost for the maintenance. We don't know what that will mean for individual school districts at this time. That is something that we have brought up with SED and individual members who are paying some of those costs now already to try to determine how that works. But we will be back with more information on that one.
Someone asked about sharing the Q&A. What we generally do is we take these questions and we work on developing answers, and we use those in our future state updates and news wires and presentations. So yes, I mean, so we're not going to release necessarily an FAQ, but we will be sharing, we'll be working on developing the answers and sharing answers to all these questions, you know, with members as soon as we can. Another question that I wanted to, so as I said earlier, none of the expense-based aid changes happened, but one of the ones that was specifically of concern to districts that were in the midst of projects or planning projects is the, you know, potential restrictions on turf or athletic fields. None of those made it in the final budget. So those are not things districts will face. Transportation aid for bus routes running for 4 p.m. There were not limits on that. What they did was and I don't have the number in front of me, slightly expanded the cap of reimbursable aid pool for after 4 p.m. transportation. So guidance for paying freezes or also potential notices, layoffs, we don't have any specific answers at this point because there's just, again, so much uncertainty right now.
Regarding how schools can calculate what their share of that hypothetical $500 million reduction would be, it's still unclear how the state would go forward with any cuts mid-year. We are in communication with the executive, but all of that is subject to some political gamemanship. I mean, the legislature can still reject any proposed cuts by the director of budget, so there would need to be some agreement between the executive and the legislature in that regard.
Yeah, and just lost my train of thought.
Will the increased costs for those residential placements be offset by an increase in excess cost aid? That's a great question that we can look into.
The question of pandemic adjustment being used to support the services that are being provided during the crisis. Again, the actual stimulus money is not going to districts, but there should be, because districts were ordered to provide these services, ways of expecting reimbursement. So, you know, track everything. In the guidance from child nutrition that came out, I believe they said that all the meals provided will be reimbursed at the free meal rate. But be sure to track carefully all the expenses and all of the meals, et cetera, that you are providing or undertaking during this time. Question about Black property tax report card and the BOCES capital cost exclusion. Their districts are expected to go in and edit last year's property tax report card to only include the BOCES capital amount. So then in this year's report card, there would be a credit if the amount, or a deficit if the amount changed. So districts should have edited last year's property tax report card to include their share of the BOCES capital amount. All right. So Tom, do you know the answers to? Victor asked, with the extension of the school closure through April 29th via the latest executive order, are paying part-time hourly workers to continue with the latest order? Or are these payments supposed to continue through what was originally the spring recess since it has been canceled by the governor?
I'm unsure how the spring recess impacts it. We can certainly look into that, but I don't have a good answer to that question.
Someone asked about federal government providing lost revenue money in New York State. There's always the potential for further stimulus. I believe today the Democrats are talking about providing another round of stimulus targeting states, but there's so much contingency with this that it's hard to plan on any specific outcome. So at this point, we have what we have. The state got a little over $1 billion for K-12 schools. And the state's budget is definitely built on having scenarios for if there is no federal stimulus, or if there is, because it is able to do those mid-period adjustments.
In regard to the FEMA webinar, they said to account for expenses during pandemic, including an instructional going through this time. Do you think state aid this year may be reduced by what FEMA would possibly reimburse? So it is my understanding that FEMA aid would be for expenses that go above and beyond what it would normally be expended. So I don't see it as necessarily reducing state aid. However, I really can't give a definitive answer on that, simply because it's the financial situation in the state is so potentially dire.
This is actually what I tried to say earlier when I'd lost my train of thought. And Tom, because Tom asked the question, a version of this question, which is, how might districts try to estimate or anticipate what their worst case scenario reduction aid is? And the problem is we don't know how the state would do that. And we can come up with, if the state wants to use a formula or a method, we can develop at least a half a dozen of those off the top of our heads, right? It could be an equal percentage reduction. It could be based on your share of total aid, or your share of foundation aid, or your share of foundation aid before phase-in, or based on other measures of capacity and need. So there is no way of being able to know what the state would do and then taking that and applying it. So that's why we're again saying wait till April 30th and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Also part of the FEMA webinar, which was mentioned in the questions again, which is a great reminder. Thank you. I believe it was an anonymous attendee. In that same webinar, FEMA did say that any directives that came from the state would need to be billed to the state, not FEMA. So the delivery of meals and such would not necessarily be reimbursed directly through FEMA. The state would have an opportunity themselves to request funds from FEMA for those services. However, it would all have to funnel through the state. I think our greatest piece of advice, and Andrew mentioned this earlier, regarding any services that you're providing due to the corona response, would be just to keep track of as much as you can. Meticulous record keeping in these times is key to making sure that you can get as much money back for providing these essential services as you can. That would be my #1 piece of advice.
And again, Tom and I will be going through and using these questions to, you know, as we reach out to SED or the state for answers, and we'll certainly be sharing these in future state updates. So the questions are very helpful. If you come up with any after the fact, you know, again, email them to us.
There was a question, do we know if the tax relief credit is being offered to districts that stay within the cap? That was a incentive that the state gave to municipalities and other taxpayers who stayed within the tax cap, both at the local level and the school district level. I don't know if that was included in the final budget, but we can certainly look into that. I know that was being discussed prior to some of the volatility, so I will look into that. There's a question regarding how mid-year cuts may relate to the gap elimination adjustment. So Andrew did look into that, and we reviewed how the gap elimination adjustment was distributed through the state. The main difference, and I think Andrew could probably correct me if I'm wrong here, with how the gap elimination adjustment was implemented was it was distributed through the state, and then there was federal funds which were then used to offset a majority of those cuts that first year.
They were sent directly to district. So
right.
We are going to verify this, but because I know that Judge Joe Dragone, you know, helped us out with this, that during the GEA, the ARA money went to districts. I don't think that's happening with the federal stimulus money, but we will confirm that. And obviously, if it is, we will let you know as soon as possible. Yeah. But I don't believe that's the case.
Right. The federal stimulus money, from everything that I've read in the federal bill, as well as conversations with SED, is going directly to the state to offset those cuts. It's unlikely that they will really impact the day-to-day. The way that it's being implemented, you shouldn't actually notice a significant change from everything we've heard. I need to talk about relaxing the fund balance restriction. I believe Mike was discussing that with OSC auditors regarding the 4% fund balance restrictions, and got a non-committal. Oh, there he is. Maybe he can speak to that.
Yeah, we did ask OSC about audits and how exceeding the 4% would be handled in future audits, and the response was basically OSC is aware of the circumstances and take those into consideration in determining our audit findings next year. So I'm thinking they're going to give you a pass if you can show why the 4% and how the 4% was used. So and we did ask, you know, we asked SED and the governor's office about the 4% as well, and also about excess reserve funds like we did during the GEA. Excess EBLR funds were used to help set aid cuts, and so we similar initiative this time around, and we haven't heard back on that as well.
So the question I asked after 4 p.m. transportation, so a couple people asked this. I believe they raised the cap that New York City can get for transporting kids after 4 p.m. So looking at it, the law, it's altering it. The law is built on reimbursements for transportation in New York City. So that is that just raised the cap, I think, $500,000. So it won't affect, school district transportation.
There was a question about letting go staff or staff reductions and pandemic adjustment. I don't believe there's any connection between the federal stimulus money and staff reductions.
Yeah, no, those types of protections were in for recipients of like SBA loans and other federal funds, but from everything that we've seen, it doesn't apply necessarily to the pandemic adjustment funds.
So someone asked about the reduction mentioned, the $500 million reduction. So $500 million is 1.83% of the school spending budget for 2020-21, right? So in the absence of a waiver or any other changes to law, assuming the state wants to keep the federal stimulus, which I think is the safest assumption we can make today, that would be the floor of the cuts the state could make to overall state aid. 1.83% probably would not be equally distributed between school districts based on how previous cuts have been made, right? It's how the GEA operated. But that is the overall amount that $500 million represents. That's the kind of answer, though, where to say do with it as you will, but that's the number to sort of the most definitive number to keep in mind. Is that's what the state can cut overall if it keeps to that amount.
On that subject, there was a question: what is the timing of receiving the federal CARES money from the state? Can they withhold it to use for their cash flow issues? So in the federal statute, the state can withhold up to 10% of the federal CARES total funding for education for their own, for basically SED, and to distribute as grants. However, they aren't able to withhold more than that. So they can't withhold the federal money. Now the issue, once again, is these mid-year cuts. They can make further cuts to your general state aid, which wouldn't technically be withholding that federal money, but they can withhold their general funds from being sent to schools. So it's not a great answer. I'm sorry, but it's unclear.
I want to just recap, since it was someone asked again to go over this. So the budget vote is not set yet, right? So the school budget vote has just been delayed. It was we have confirmed that the government, because the governor's executive order didn't mention school budgets, but we've confirmed that's included in the executive order that delayed every budget till at least June 1st, because votes happen in New York on Tuesdays. June 2nd would be the likely earliest possible date. What will happen when that date is set is we will know all of the any other changes that are made. So when the governor sets a date, we'll also likely know if there's any other changes to the calendar. If there are no changes to the calendar, we have a final date here, and then everything else works backwards, unless I'm mirrored and it looks like I'm going forwards in my video. But that's where we're at. So you will then go back 6 days or 12, whatever the existing laws are about all of the budget steps. And so we'll be, if that happens, working to develop a calendar to share. Is our interpretation of the budget, enacted budget has language that is broad enough to impact future stimulus money, and that future stimulus might be offset by a negative state aid adjustment?
So the state budget is built around the idea that there will be additional federal funds, according to some analysts, that they are expecting to receive about $10 billion in a future federal stimulus bill. So that's one way to answer it. I mean, they are banking on the federal funds coming through again.
And they also have there is a lot of discretion in the budget. Generally, there's a lot of discretion in the budget that is never used for adjustment payments. So there's nothing in the budget that locks them out from altering things if they get more stimulus money.
Yep. And there is, as Andrew mentioned earlier, if the economic condition of the state improves dramatically, they will be able to restore any funding cuts. So that does go both ways. It just remains to be seen how everything will play out both at the federal level and with the state's economy.
So following up the question about the non-allowable pupil decimal, we've asked SED. They put it in their list of questions they know we have that they're working on. So we will let you know once we find out. But obviously, if you're not running transportation, you couldn't do an actual account. And then, will transportation aid be delivered on miles for food delivery? Again, we've asked, and we don't have an answer yet.
Is there still discussion that if districts stay at or below the cap, they are automatically approved, or instead use absentee ballots for their elections? We've had conversations with SED. It seems incredibly unlikely that districts would be able to automatically approve their budgets. I know NISCUS and ASBO were both supportive of those types of policies. However, there's been significant pushback from the executive at SED and the legislature on that type of policy. They are working on a system. Hopefully they're discussing options regarding absentee ballots. I think they're trying to implement a system that would extend beyond just school budget votes and go into the primary elections as well as any special elections that are upcoming. There is discussion, and we're part of them, but it's definitely still ongoing.
Well, and just to emphasize, that's one that they're working. Like there are a number of questions that are important to ask because they affect us, affect you so significantly, but also that we know they're working on. So we keep, being involved in the conversation on, the guidance for contracts, transportation aid, all of those issues, the budget votes. There are unfortunately no answers yet. Same with just the more general question about any aids paid on services that you aren't actually providing. We don't know. That's going to be something that we will know hopefully fairly soon. Yeah, so people sharing their attorney's advice. Different attorneys have had different interpretations of how districts should respond to contractual obligations right now. And so we are looking for guidance from the state, and it's not available yet. The other concern is that unless you've not had enough of questions that we are asking but don't have answers for yet, is what do we do about instructional days, work days, school calendar, distance learning? We bring all of those up in our regular conversations with SED and with the state, and don't have answers yet. But we are aware that contractual issues and contracts can vary by district, and so we need to have solutions that address all of those.
There's a question regarding have a Board of Election or a Board of Education elections been postponed? Yes, they were also postponed, as well as the budget votes till at least June. Until at least June. It's unclear. We don't have a date for when those would take place, but those were part of that postponement.
And we will reach out and confirm the property tax report card date right now. It's going to depend. I mean, if the date is fixed in the statute, they would still be requiring it. But we will inquire and we'll put that in our next stated update.
Yeah, according to SED's website, it's no later than 24 days before the budget vote. So
Okay.
if the budget vote hasn't been set, then I'm guessing that the 27th date is no longer valid. But like Andrew said, we will check with SED.
I mean, that's what I thought based on when we talked to our last call with SED. I thought that's what, but we will confirm just because people have that question.
There's a question regarding, oh, I lost it. Does that hold true for getting petitions as well for new board members? I believe NISBA's been commenting on this regarding lowering the thresholds for some of the petitions. It's unclear how the deadlines are impacted by the shift in the election, but we can certainly look into that.
So the question about revising your district's budget based on the outcomes of the April 30th review and the timeline running in May, there's no budget actual submission deadline until the vote is set. And if the vote is not the first week in June, which is maybe an assumption we can talk about, then that would move things even further. But SED is absolutely aware that the uncertainty districts are facing with their budgeting. And they're from my take, very sympathetic to that and trying to find solutions that help districts manage that timeline. The final cost report due date, I don't believe that they were interested in relaxing deadlines for that.
There's a question regarding the STAR credit checks that would not be sent to taxpayers who are delinquent on their property taxes if the state would have to pay those out if the property owner became current on their property taxes, if they're still encumbered by that, or if they're simply voided. I'm not sure. I would have to look at the bill language again to see if it mentions the future applicability of those. I'll look into that.
How is the GEA reduction apportioned to school districts? It would be a good point of reference. I don't have the method in front of me. I can tell you that the state made an approximately 10% cut to school aid in the first year and then filled in stimulus money to make up more than half of that, and that so lower need districts saw more of their aid cut than higher need districts, but I don't know the actual method of a district level of GEA determination. And again, we will be going through this Q&A, compiling all of the questions, getting answers to them, and trying to share them in future updates to the extent that we can.
Does the increased maintenance cost of residential placements only apply to students enrolled in state-operated schools? So there's two separate things. There's the increased cost sharing for placements made through the Committees on Special Education, and then the elimination of the maintenance costs for students enrolled in schools for state-operated schools for the deaf and the blind. So I don't know how to answer that question other than with that, but feel free to email me, and we can get to the bottom of the problem.
Finally, someone just pointed out that it's increasingly hard to continue emergency food service with food contractors being unable to staff districts. I think discussion about next steps has confirmed cases and fatalities increase. This is a larger issue that extends beyond school districts to all of the essential workers. And the state does not yet have an answer, but it's clearly something that both at a state level and also across the country is a prominent issue. And we will ask about the capital outlay projects because those are triggered to be one-year projects. And we will find out what SED's approach to that is. So I think we have gone through and tagged the questions as much as we can. I want to say it's pretty incredible. We have 350 people still with us. So I want to thank you all for all of the questions and all of the just thoughts districts have shared. You know, Tom and I and Mike and everyone, you know, we work really hard, but we, you know, because we're not in districts, hearing your perspectives, the issues that pop up that you are facing, really help guide us in our conversations internally with the state, et cetera. So, you know, keep letting us know questions you have, issues that pop up, solutions you have as you come up with them. Let's see, a couple more things popped up. Is there state level clarification on the financial responsibility for providing daycare to essential social or societal workers?
So there is, the only specific people mentioned in the executive order are the healthcare workers and the first responders, and they are, you know, supposed to be the primary audience for the childcare services. So I mean, it's unclear how that applies to the other essential workers, the grocery store workers, and such.
Reserves can be flexible for use, general use. We've talked about this again. This is not something this is something that happened before. Mike mentioned in his comment earlier that during GEA, I believe Evlar Reserve was made available for districts to draw on. We've talked with the state about potential flexibility, but there is nothing yet. So as of now, no, but it's something that's definitely been talked about. And Tom, you want to tackle the construction essentialness?
So we have heard that school districts and government operations are exempt from the prohibition on construction projects, provided that they still maintain the social distancing and safe working conditions that occur. To get further backup, though, you can always contact the Empire State Development Corp to get specific guidance on your capital project. I believe it's probably safe to say if it is a non-essential construction project, you know, it might be better off to hold off or contact Empire State Development Corp for further guidance regarding that. However, local governments, including school districts, are exempt from the construction moratorium.
And it popped up was we have teachers asking for reimbursement or compensation for days worked during spring break. Is there any potential for these mandates to restrict impact bargaining? This just touches on the more general issue, which is, especially as things settle down, what is the, from a micro level, the grievance situation to a more larger level, what is the contractual situation that districts face with all of the imposed distance learning, potential changes to the calendar, et cetera. There is not an answer yet. An answer has to be a big picture answer. So it has to come from probably an executive order. But we are definitely, as I said earlier, this is one of the questions that the concerns that we keep sharing with everyone we talk to, is that districts face these challenges. So when you're crafting responses, please be aware.
So do districts have a responsibility to pay for the childcare costs for healthcare and other essential workers? I think we're still waiting further guidance on how that cost will be borne. School districts have the responsibility to provide childcare for healthcare and other essential workers, either themselves, or I know that there are some school districts we're contracting out to providers who do daycare services or child after school care services already. But as far as how that will be aided or not aided, it's unclear. Mike, did you have?
There was an executive order that allowed school districts to pay. It didn't require them to pay, but the executive order allowed school districts to provide and pay for childcare if they wanted to. So again, that could be something that schools could seek reimbursement later on from FEMA or from the state, and which is why it's important to keep track of all your ordinary expenses related to responding to the COVID pandemic.
All right. Well, I think we have, again, as I said, we still have 320 people on here. Thank you so much for doing this. Let's see. All right. Someone asked, is the pandemic adjustment line of the school aid run something that can be fluctuating in fiscal year 21, or is this a figure for the LEA locked in? So the pandemic adjustment amount, we covered it in this presentation because it's on there and we want you to know where it comes from. Right? So the pandemic adjustment amount is your district's share of 1.1, roughly $1 billion based on your district's share of Title I funding that when which SED used to calculate the amounts. That amount, it's more just an accounting method for the state to say this is how we're giving 1.1 billion to schools. So beyond seeing it in your aid runs and being able to answer questions when your board, your superintendent, community asks about it, our feeling is that this is not a number that should be your biggest focus, because it's not something that you're experiencing at the district level, and it will not be, is very unlikely to be the basis for any potential mid-year aid reductions going forward.
So there was a question, is it possible to publish the questions that have been answered live with a brief, concise transcript of response? We will be using these questions to send out further guidance and state updates, but there won't be a transcript of the webinar available. Unfortunately, we just don't have that capacity.
Yes, and Ken Howard is right. This is absolutely a fluid situation, and the answers can just pop up sometimes. We are all, I imagine many of you are, but we are all carefully monitoring multiple ASBO staff watch every governor's address. We are consistently in conversation with members of the legislature, members of the executive, SED, OSC, DOB, whatever we need to be talking to. So we are working as hard as we can to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on, to gather your concerns and questions and share them and get answers.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'll wrap up now, and we will be taking your questions and compiling them and trying to find as many answers as we can from the executive chamber and from SED. And we will be posting those answers on through our state updates and on our website. So again, that's all. Thank you, Andrew and Tom, Rebecca, and everyone else at ASBO putting this together.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks.
All right. Bye now.